Imagine waking up one day with the sudden realization that everything you were praised for is the very reason you are losing. You were honest when others lied, patient when others pushed, kind when others exploited. You followed the rules. You did the right thing. You gave people the benefit of the doubt. And yet somehow, you're the one left behind. You look around and notice something deeply unsettling. The people who cut corners seem to advance faster. The ones who say no without guilt protect their time. The ones who bend truth when necessary control outcomes. Meanwhile, you are exhausted, confused by a quiet sense of betrayal that no one ever warned you about. Because you did everything right. So why does it feel so wrong? This is the question that almost no one wants to confront. From childhood, you were taught a simple equation. Goodness leads to success. Be moral, be kind, be fair, and life will reward you. This belief feels comforting. It gives meaning to restraint. It justifies patience. It transforms suffering into something noble. But reality keeps interrupting the story. You watch promotions go to those who self-promote rather than self-sacrifice. You see manipulators labeled as confident, while conscientious people are labeled difficult. You notice that those who assert boundaries are respected, while those who accommodate endlessly are taken for granted. And slowly, a dangerous thought emerges. What if being a good person doesn't protect you? What if it makes you predictable? What if moral innocence is not strength, but exposure? This is not a comfortable realization. It threatens your identity. Because if goodness does not guarantee safety, then everything you endured in silence must be re-examined. Every time you swallowed anger. Every time you avoided conflict. Every time you told yourself, this is just how decent people behave. Ask yourself something unsettling. How many times have you confused patience with wisdom? How often have you mistaken compliance for maturity? How many losses have you reframed as doing the right thing just to survive the disappointment? The world praises goodness, but it does not protect it. This is the contradiction no one prepares you for. Morality is taught as armor, but often functions like an open signal. It tells others exactly how far they can push before you resist. It reveals what you will tolerate. It announces that you will absorb harm rather than redirect it. And those who understand this, consciously or not, use it. Not always maliciously. Often casually. Sometimes instinctively. They ask for just a little more. They cross boundaries because none are enforced. They take advantage not because they are evil, but because they can. You begin to notice that goodness, when unprotected, attracts pressure the way gravity attracts mass. This is where the real danger begins. Because the failure that follows is not sudden. It's slow, quiet, rationalized. You don't collapse, you erode. You tell yourself you're being patient when you're actually avoiding confrontation. You tell yourself you're being understanding when you're actually training others to disregard you. You tell yourself you're choosing peace when you're really choosing safety over agency. And still, you wait for the reward that never arrives. No one tells you that moral systems are not designed to ensure success. They are designed to regulate behavior. They teach you how to act, but not how to survive competition, negotiation, or power dynamics. They offer rules, but not protection. This is why the most painful failures feel confusing rather than dramatic. There is no villain, no obvious betrayal, just the slow realization that the world does not operate on fairness. It operates on leverage. And leverage does not care about intention. So the question sharpens, becoming impossible to ignore. Is being a good person actually a disadvantage in an unfair world? At what point does morality stop being virtue and start becoming vulnerability? And why do those who abandon innocence often seem to win? The answers are not flattering. They will not affirm what you were taught. They will force you to confront something deeper than ethics, something psychological, something structural, something hidden beneath the language of goodness itself. Because the problem is not that goodness is wrong. It's that goodness, unexamined, is incomplete. And until you understand why, the same pattern will repeat, quietly, relentlessly, no matter how sincere your intentions are. This is where we have to go next. The problem is not that being a good person is wrong. The problem is that goodness, as it is commonly taught, is incomplete and psychologically dangerous when mistaken for protection. To see why, you must look beneath morality and into the machinery of the human mind. From a psychological standpoint, being good often becomes a strategy, not for navigating reality, but for avoiding it. You learn early that approval follows compliance, that conflict threatens belonging, that asserting yourself risks rejection. Over time, morality fuses with safety. Goodness stops being a value and starts becoming a shield against discomfort. But shields only work if the world agrees not to strike. What develops instead is a quiet internal contract. If I behave well enough, I won't be harmed. This belief is rarely conscious, but it governs behavior relentlessly. You suppress anger because it feels dangerous. You avoid confrontation because it feels immoral. You tolerate unfairness because you believe patience will be rewarded. This is not virtue. It is psychological bargaining. At the philosophical level, this mindset is reinforced by moral narratives that equate goodness with worthiness. You are taught that decent people are deserving people, that fairness is the natural order, that bad actions produce bad outcomes, and good actions produce good ones. The world, in this story, is fundamentally just misaligned only by temporary corruption. But reality does not operate on moral symmetry. It operates on incentives. When goodness becomes predictable, it becomes exploitable. Predictability invites pressure. Pressure invites testing. And testing reveals boundaries, or the lack of them. Once others discover that your morality prevents you from enforcing limits, they adapt. Not always consciously. Often instinctively. This is how exploitation becomes normalized without anyone ever becoming a villain. The deeper issue is that moral conditioning often disconnects people from their capacity for assertive aggression, the psychological function that enforces boundaries and corrects imbalance. Aggression in its healthy form is not cruelty. It is the signal that says, this stops here. When that function is moralized into guilt, it doesn't disappear, it goes dormant. And dormant aggression doesn't protect you. It turns inward. This is where resentment begins. You tell yourself you're choosing kindness, but your body keeps score. You feel tension in your jaw, fatigue in your chest, irritation you can't justify. You begin to resent those who take what you give freely. You feel invisible, undervalued. Yet you hesitate to change because change feels like betrayal of your identity, your values, your self-image as a good person. Psychologically, this creates a trap. Your morality becomes fused with your sense of self. To assert yourself would feel like becoming someone else, someone worse, someone dangerous, someone not you. So you stay still. Philosophically, this mirrors an ancient error, confusing moral intention with moral outcome. Many ethical systems prioritize purity of intent, what you meant, what you felt, what you believed. But the world responds to effects, not intentions. You can mean well and still cause damage. You can act kindly and still enable harm. You can be morally sincere and practically destructive to yourself. This is where moral innocence becomes a liability. In social systems, power does not concentrate around goodness. It concentrates around reliability, leverage, and consequence. People who can say no and make it stick shape environments. People who can tolerate conflict gain authority. People who can risk being disliked retain autonomy. When you are good but ineffective, you become useful, but not respected. And respect is the currency that determines how far others will go with you. The philosophical root of the problem is the belief that morality is sufficient for navigation. That if you simply are good, the world will align. But morality does not teach you how to negotiate competing interests. It does not teach you how to handle bad actors. It does not teach you how to respond when values clash and someone must lose. So when these moments arise, as they inevitably do, you freeze. Not because you don't know what's happening, but because your moral framework offers no tools for response. It only offers judgment. And judgment, without action, changes nothing. There is also a hidden comfort in this passivity. If you believe failure came from being too good, you never have to confront harder truths. That you avoided risk, that you refused confrontation, that you outsourced responsibility to fairness itself. Moral innocence allows you to remain blameless, but powerless. This is why the belief is so difficult to abandon. Because abandoning it means accepting something far heavier than injustice, responsibility. It means admitting that goodness does not entitle you to safety. That fairness is not enforced by reality. That outcomes are shaped by those willing to engage with discomfort, not those who avoid it. Once you see this, the emotional tension intensifies. Because now you're forced to ask questions that threaten your identity. Was I kind, or was I afraid? Was I patient, or was I passive? Was I moral, or was I avoiding conflict at my own expense? These questions don't condemn goodness. They demand depth. They demand that morality grow teeth. That values be paired with enforcement. That kindness be chosen, not defaulted. Until then, goodness remains fragile. And fragility invites pressure. This is the hidden problem beneath repeated failure. Not that you were wrong to value goodness, but that you were never taught how to protect it in a world that doesn't share your restraint. And the consequences of this gap are not abstract. They shape careers, relationships, leadership, and self-respect. They ripple outward, quietly, until one day you realize your life has been shaped more by what you tolerated than by what you chose. That realization hurts. But it is also the beginning of clarity. Because once you understand the psychological and philosophical roots of this failure, you can no longer blame fate, luck, or morality itself. You begin to see the unseen forces at work, how conditioning, incentives, and fear collaborate beneath the surface. And that is where we must go next. The most damaging consequences of being a good person are rarely dramatic. They don't arrive as disasters. They arrive as patterns, quiet, repeating outcomes that feel personal, confusing, and strangely inevitable. You don't notice them all at once. You notice them over time, in what keeps happening to you. You begin to see that certain doors never open. That certain lines are crossed repeatedly. That certain people always seem to rise while you remain reliable, supportive, and easily overlooked. This is not bad luck. It is conditioning meeting reality. When goodness is not paired with boundary enforcement, it reshapes how others perceive you. Not consciously, not maliciously, but behavior adapts to incentives. When someone learns, through repeated interaction, that you will absorb discomfort rather than create it, they adjust accordingly. They ask more. They push further. They take longer to reciprocate. They assume your availability, your forgiveness, your patience. And each time you comply, the pattern stabilizes. This is how the unseen consequence takes root. Your identity becomes synonymous with tolerance. And tolerance, in social systems, is not respected, it is budgeted. You become the person others rely on to absorb friction. The one who smooths things over. The one who understands. The one who won't retaliate. This feels noble, until you realize what it costs. In workplaces, it means your labor becomes invisible. You are trusted but not promoted. Valued but not protected. Leadership gravitates toward those who signal consequence, not those who signal accommodation. Your goodness makes you dependable, but dependence is not power. In relationships, the pattern deepens. You give the benefit of the doubt until doubt becomes habit. You forgive until forgiveness becomes expectation. You explain away behavior that should have been corrected early. Over time, imbalance becomes normal. By the time you feel resentment, the dynamic is already established, and changing it feels like betrayal rather than correction. This is where cognitive bias locks the trap. The sunk cost fallacy convinces you to endure longer. I've already invested so much. The self-consistency bias urges you to stay the same. This is who I am. The moral licensing effect tells others they can take more. You're so understanding. And the just world bias whispers the most dangerous lie of all. Eventually, things will even out. They rarely do. At the neurological level, Repeated tolerance without resolution trains your stress response into a state of chronic suppression. You feel tired rather than angry, anxious rather than assertive. You lose clarity, not because you don't understand what's happening, but because your body has learned that action leads to guilt. Your nervous system adapts to restraint, not empowerment. This is why the consequences feel psychological before they feel practical. You hesitate longer. You second-guess yourself. You rehearse conversations you never have. You carry the emotional labor of situations you did not create. And then comes the most painful realization. People don't see your goodness the way you feel it. They don't experience it as virtue. They experience it as absence of resistance. This realization is destabilizing because it undermines a core belief that morality is self-evident. That goodness announces itself. That others will recognize and respect it naturally. They won't, unless it is reinforced. On a societal level, the same pattern scales upward. Cultures that idealize patience over confrontation tolerate dysfunction longer than they should. Institutions preserve politeness at the expense of accountability. Systems decay quietly because addressing them would require discomfort, conflict, and the willingness to be perceived as harsh. This is how unfair systems persist without overt oppression. No one enforces them violently. They are sustained by the silence of those who don't want to disrupt moral harmony. Good people become the glue that holds broken systems together. And here lies the deepest unseen consequence. Goodness delays necessary correction. By absorbing harm, you prevent feedback from reaching its source. The system doesn't change because it doesn't feel the cost. The person doesn't adjust because nothing forces them to. Your tolerance becomes the buffer that allows dysfunction to continue. This is not compassion. It is enablement disguised as virtue. The tragedy is that when collapse finally comes, when resentment explodes, when burnout hits, when trust is exhausted, it feels sudden and extreme. Others are shocked. They say you changed. They say you're being unreasonable. But the truth is simpler. You reached the limit you should have enforced long ago. By then, the damage is already done. This is why the failure associated with being good feels so deeply personal. You followed the rules. You acted correctly. And still, you lost leverage, respect, and autonomy. The world did not meet you halfway. It kept moving forward, guided by those willing to shape outcomes rather than endure them. And this realization creates a dangerous fork in the road. One path leads to bitterness. You conclude that goodness itself is a lie. That kindness is weakness. That only cruelty wins. This path hardens you, but it doesn't free you. It merely replaces passivity with hostility. The other path is more difficult. It requires recognizing that goodness was never meant to function alone. That morality without strength is not virtue. It is vulnerability. That being good does not excuse you from learning how power works. Because power is not evil. It is inevitable. And those who refuse to understand it do not escape its effects. They experience them from the weakest position possible. This is the moment where discomfort becomes unavoidable. Where the narrative you lived by no longer explains your life. Where the gap between who you are and how the world responds becomes too large to ignore. This is also the moment where change becomes possible. Because once you see the unseen consequences clearly, once you understand how goodness, when unprotected, quietly engineers failure, you can no longer pretend the solution is simply be better. Something else is required. Something counterintuitive. Something uncomfortable. Something that challenges the very definition of what it means to be good. That is where the rebellion begins. Breaking free does not mean abandoning goodness. It means refusing to let goodness operate without power. This is where most people misunderstand the rebellion. They assume the alternative to being too good is becoming ruthless, cold, or selfish. But that belief is itself a residue of moral conditioning. The false binary that says you must choose between kindness and strength, between integrity and effectiveness. The rebellion begins when you reject that false choice. The first shift is internal and deeply uncomfortable. You stop using morality as a hiding place. You no longer treat being good as proof that you don't need to confront, assert, or risk disapproval. You begin to see that avoiding conflict is not the same as transcending it. Often, it is simply surrendering the field to those who are willing to engage. This requires reclaiming something you were taught to distrust: assertive force. Not violence, not cruelty, but the capacity to say no and mean it. Healthy aggression is the psychological mechanism that protects boundaries and restores balance. It is what allows you to interrupt exploitation early, before it hardens into structure. When you reclaim this function, your goodness changes character. It becomes deliberate instead of automatic, chosen instead of defaulted. You stop being good because you're afraid of what happens if you're not. You start being good because you can afford to be. The second shift is behavioral. You begin to prioritize consequence over explanation. Instead of over-communicating, justifying, and hoping to be understood, you let your actions establish limits. You recognize that people learn less from your intentions than from what you tolerate. And so you tolerate less, without hostility, without apology, without drama. This is where many feel guilt. Because guilt is the emotional residue of old conditioning. It arises not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are doing something new. You are breaking an internal rule: don't make others uncomfortable. But discomfort is not harm. It is feedback. And feedback is how systems adjust. When you allow others to feel the natural consequences of their behavior, you are not being unkind. You are refusing to subsidize dysfunction. This is the moment your environment begins to change. People who relied on your tolerance pull back, or push harder. Both reactions are revealing. Those who respect boundaries adjust. Those who don't expose themselves. Either way, clarity increases. And clarity is power. The third shift is philosophical. You redefine goodness not as harmlessness, but as alignment between values and action. A good person is no longer someone who avoids harm at all costs, but someone who prevents greater harm by intervening early. Someone who understands that short-term discomfort can avert long-term damage. Someone who is willing to be misjudged to protect what matters. This reframing dissolves the fear that strength corrupts morality. Strength only corrupts morality when it is unconscious. When power is denied, it acts blindly. When power is acknowledged and disciplined, it becomes a tool rather than a threat. You stop measuring yourself by how pure your intentions feel and start measuring yourself by whether your actions produce dignity for yourself and others. This also requires abandoning a seductive illusion that everyone must like you for you to be good. Approval is not a moral metric. It is a social response shaped by incentives. When your behavior changes, some approval will evaporate. That loss is not a failure. It is the cost of autonomy. And autonomy is the condition under which integrity becomes possible. The rebellion deepens when you accept responsibility for outcomes. You stop blaming unfairness. You stop waiting for recognition. You stop hoping morality will speak on your behalf. Instead, you ask harder questions. What am I enabling by staying silent? What pattern am I reinforcing by tolerating this? What future am I quietly consenting to? These questions strip away moral comfort, but they return something far more valuable: agency. Agency allows you to act before resentment builds, to correct without cruelty, to walk away without guilt, to remain kind without becoming small. At this stage, something surprising happens. Your goodness becomes rarer, but stronger. It is no longer everywhere. It is no longer automatic. And because of that, it begins to matter. When you give, it carries weight. When you forgive, it is meaningful. When you cooperate, it is chosen. People feel the difference immediately. Not because you are harsher, but because you are clearer. And clarity is stabilizing. This is why the rebellion is not chaotic. It does not turn you into a threat. It turns you into a constant. Someone whose behavior is predictable because it is anchored to boundaries, not moods. Someone who can be trusted because they will not silently absorb what they cannot sustain. The final shift is existential. You release the fantasy that goodness guarantees safety. And in doing so, you free goodness from the burden of protecting you. You accept that protection is your responsibility. That fairness must be enforced. That values must be defended, not merely professed. This is where strength and goodness finally integrate. You no longer confuse being harmless with being virtuous. You no longer confuse endurance with wisdom. You no longer confuse suffering with meaning. You understand that goodness without agency is fragile, and fragility invites domination. But goodness with agency becomes something else entirely, a stabilizing force that can withstand pressure without collapsing into resentment or cruelty. This is the rebellion's quiet victory. Not domination over others, but sovereignty over yourself. Yet even this is not the final realization. Because once you live this way, once you reclaim power without abandoning conscience, you begin to see something deeper still. A truth that reframes not just failure, but success. A realization that explains why so many people cling to innocence even as it harms them. That realization is not comforting, but it is liberating. And it waits in the final section. Here is the truth most people never reach. Not because it is hidden, but because it is unbearable to accept. Being a good person was never meant to make you safe. That belief is the final illusion. Goodness was never armor. It was never leverage. It was never protection. It was a value, meant to guide action, not replace it. The failure comes when goodness is mistaken for immunity. When morality is treated as a force that operates independently of strength, consequence, and responsibility. When you believe that if you are decent enough, the world will adjust around you. It will not. Reality does not reward moral intent. It responds to structure, pressure, and enforcement. This is the realization that quietly separates adulthood from innocence. Children believe rules are enforced by fairness. Adults learn rules are enforced by people. And people respond not to who you are inside, but to what you allow, what you reinforce, and what you are willing to lose in order to protect what matters. This is why goodness fails so often, not because it is wrong, but because it is incomplete when stripped of agency. Once you see this, something painful but clarifying happens. You stop feeling betrayed by life. You stop asking, why did this happen to me if I did everything right? That question dissolves, because you finally understand the premise was false. You were never guaranteed anything. The world does not owe you fairness for your restraint. People do not owe you respect for your patience. Outcomes do not owe you justice for your intentions. And strangely, this is where peace begins. Because when you let go of the expectation that goodness should protect you, you are free to decide how you will protect goodness instead. You no longer rely on moral hope. You rely on conscious choice. This is the deepest shift of all. You realize that morality is not a passive state. It is an active discipline. It requires courage, not compliance. Strength, not avoidance. The willingness to intervene, not merely endure. This reframes everything. Your past failures stop looking like evidence of weakness and start looking like lessons in power you were never taught. You were trained to be good, but not to be effective. To be kind, but not to be dangerous when necessary. To be patient, but not to be firm. Now you see the missing half. Goodness without strength is fragile. Strength without goodness is destructive. But together, they form something rare. Integrity that survives reality. This is why so many people cling to innocence long after it stops serving them. Because innocence absolves them of responsibility. If failure comes from being too good, then no further growth is required. No confrontation, no risk, no transformation. But the cost of innocence is agency. And agency is the price of meaning. Once you accept this, the world changes, not because it becomes kinder, but because it becomes clearer. You stop moralizing outcomes and start shaping them. You stop absorbing harm and start redirecting it. You stop waiting to be rewarded and start choosing what you are willing to defend. You also stop judging yourself by how harmless you are. You begin judging yourself by harder, more honest questions. Did I act when it mattered? Did I enforce what I valued? Did I protect my dignity without abandoning my conscience? These questions do not flatter. They do not comfort. But they do something better. They make you effective. And effectiveness is what allows goodness to endure in a world that does not care about your intentions. This is the final realization. Goodness is not about being harmless. It is about being capable and choosing restraint. Not because you are afraid, but because you are in control. Once you live from this place, the quiet resentment disappears. The confusion fades. The pattern breaks. You are no longer surprised when the world tests you, because you finally understand that it always will. And now, you are prepared. Prepared to say no without guilt. Prepared to walk away without justification. Prepared to be misunderstood without collapsing. Prepared to be kind without becoming small. This is not cynicism. It is clarity. You are still a good person, but no longer an unprotected one. And that changes everything.